American Legislative Exchange Council, for those of you who don't know what that is, and if you're not a legislator, you probably don't, it's a resource for legislators. John, why don't you just tell us what it is when you come up here? I think you could probably do that better. Jonathan is Director of Tax and Fiscal Policy Task Force at ALEC. It's the nation's largest nonpartisan individual membership organization for state legislators. He's responsible for educating and advising state legislators and private sector leaders on fiscal issues, in addition to working with members to develop model legislation to enact in the states. Prior to joining ALEC, Jonathan served as the staff economist at the Tax Foundation, or a staff economist at the Tax Foundation, where he conducted tax policy research. His work's been featured in many publications, including Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Los Angeles Times, Investors Business Daily, and more. Jonathan's from Michigan, a mid-Michigan native. Graduated magna cum laude from Northwood University in Midland, Michigan, majoring economics, banking, finance, and business management. And Jonathan I guess, are you guys doing the tag team thing? Okay, Jonathan's going to start out, and they're going to be talking to us about tax reform, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right, it is good to be with you all today. I have got some bad news and some good news. The bad news is I did lose my voice somewhere on the way from D.C. to Phoenix to here. I'm not sure exactly where, but I did. The good news is I don't always sound this funny. So today I want to talk to you a little bit about taxing and some of the work that we're doing on tax policy at the American Legislative Exchange Council. Can you hear me all right over this microphone? All right. How many here are familiar with ALEC that are in the room? That's good. We got about half, so that's very good. We are, as Carl said, the nation's largest nonpartisan membership organization of conservative state legislators. We were founded in 1973, and we were originally, I believe, called the Caucus of Conservative State Legislators. And the title has changed over the years, but our mission has remained the same, and that is we're very committed to the Jeffersonian principles of free markets, limited government, individual liberty, and states' rights. Now, it's somewhat unique to hear from a D.C. organization. We have a few good ones here today that actually believe in states' rights. We've really lost that message in D.C. We get polluted by the inside the beltway mentality that Michael Tanner talked about earlier. But, you know, we at ALEC, we believe that along the lines of Ronald Reagan, that the 9 most dangerous words in the English language are, I'm from D.C. and I'm here to help. And we feel that our members in the states have many more of the solutions that we could ever figure out in Washington. And we figure that the federal government ought to be taking lessons from the states and not the other way around. Today, we face a pretty unique situation nationally in that the rosy times that many of the states had enjoyed over the last few fiscal years have disappeared. And Montana could be one of the small exceptions to that rule right now. Just for kicks and giggles, I keep an article in my folder from only about a year and a half ago that it was a report that said 41 states were posting budget surpluses, and that was 18 months ago. Today, that's almost completely turned around the other direction. As in fiscal 2009, which began in July 1st for most states, over 30 states had to close budget problems. And I believe in 49 states are required to have a balanced budget. And so they do have to take care of it in the current fiscal year. And now, in the mid-year, as we lead up to fiscal 2010, over 17 states, as last count, are already reporting budget deficits for the upcoming year, and that number seems to grow weekly. And some of the states, natural resource states, the agricultural-based states, are not going to be able to count on the high prices that they even enjoyed in the last year or two, as oil certainly has plummeted by half in the last 3 or 4 months alone. And so we certainly do have some major challenges this year. California just closed a major budget deficit with some accounting gimmicks in the last few months, and before long, a month or two later, they're already facing another multi-billion-dollar budget deficit. New York State is projecting they could have a $12 to $15 billion budget deficit in the next 2 or 3 years. And they're already talking about the quote-unquote need to raise taxes in those states. So I think from a taxpayer's perspective, 2009, 2010, they could be very dangerous years. So my advice to you all is to hold on to your wallets for the next year, because it could get really bad in many states. Now, in the good times, as Barry Paulson talked about earlier, with Montana spending, in the good times, spending that just was out of control, double-digit rates of growth every year. That was the trend across the states, and that in the good times, states have no trouble finding places to spend the extra money, and many states, really paid little attention to investing those surplus dollars for a rainy day or giving it back to the taxpayer, because, as was mentioned earlier, whose money is it in the first place? A government surplus is just another way of saying an overpayment from the taxpayer to the government that ought to be returned. And we look at this over the last, over a historical sense, I guess. In the words of Yogi Berra of the New York Yankees, this is deja vu all over again, because every time we go through a peak and a valley of the business cycle, we see this happen. In that, in the good times, when state revenues are booming, the states, no offense to Carl, but he probably knows what I'm talking about, are spending like drunken sailors on a 48-hour furlough. And in the bad times, states all of a sudden find the quote-unquote need to raise taxes. The problem is that when you have that higher level of taxes that you have in a bad time, the government, once they have that higher level of taxes, is very reticent to give that back to the taxpayer, and when the economy heats up again, and so they find themselves awash in cash, and instead of returning those tax dollars to the taxpayer where they belong, they find all sorts of interesting, innovative ways to spend that money, and I use innovative in a very loose term in that case. And so we have, the situation with the states today is very dire, and we have many state-based organizations, even some legislative organizations, NCSL, NGA, the National Governors Association, and other center-left groups, mostly left, are lobbying Congress for a federal bailout of the states. And in fact, in the last few weeks, we've had hearings on Capitol Hill that the states are in such a dire straits that we do need federal money. I guess, it wasn't enough to bail out the financial industry and the auto industry. Now the states are lining up at the trough, and who's next, really? It's really a dangerous situation we're in today in D.C. And of course, the federal bailout of the states, it was only 2002, late 2001 and 2002, we were having the same discussion, because as I mentioned earlier, this is a historical pattern. Every time we have an economic downturn, the states are, begging the federal government for money. And in 2002, we published an ALEC study talking about why the feds should not bail out the states, and it's just, several reasons. Just off the top of my head, we can talk about there is that. It's a huge moral hazard for state governments, because if they expect the federal governments to bail them out in bad times, what incentive is there to be a responsible state and budget responsibly? And not a whole lot, really. It really incentivizes big government and irresponsible spending programs. And then the other question you need to ask about a federal bailout of the states is, why should states like Montana, who are not suffering, or states that have done a better job in budgeting and have balanced the budget and are okay, why should they be subsidizing the states that are reckless, like California, New York, and these other states? And then finally is, many of us who have been around the kind of the federalism debate for years now, and Barry and Sonder and Grover could totally attest to this, there has never been a time in my experience where $1 has flowed out of Washington, D.C. without about 1,000 strings attached to it. And so if the states are lining up for a bailout, you better believe that the federal government is going to, get their due, and they're going to put a lot of new unfunded mandates on the states. So it's a very precarious situation we're in today. But that's really where we're moving at the national level, and this is going to be part of the second stimulus package that President-elect Obama said would be his #1 goal as soon as he takes office in January, if the lame